Well, hey folks, it's your old pal King Waspinator. Welcome back to Total Party Skills. For many years, the subject has been brought up, especially in regards to various science fiction properties like Star Trek, as to why the writing just seems to not quite be able to gel. There's a lot of elements in these shows that aren't bad in and of themselves conceptually, but for some reason they just can't seem to quite get them to all come together and coalesce as something that we could recognize as Star Trek. Speaking to a larger trend in general, I think a lot of it is the nature of, well, where the writers are coming from, how they're being educated, how they decide to become writers, the age that they're allowed to get jobs writing for major television shows and film, and so on and so forth. Most of the classic great science fiction, up to and including Star Trek, were written by people who went through World War II or lived in the immediate aftermath of the World Wars. People who had had to see, and in many cases do, things that had a profound effect on their character and their moral outlook on life. And armed with such experiences, they were able to bring a thoughtful depth to a lot of science fiction that, despite the fact that we now consider it cheesy because of the special effects and acting style of the era, still managed to convey ideas that were far more profound than you see in your average modern-day soap opera with explosions and crying, that they call Star Trek. Most modern-day writing rooms for Star Trek and many other properties bring people fresh out of college, people who've never had to do anything, people who have lived pampered lives, people who got into writing and were encouraged to become writers at a very young age, and not because they experienced anything and actually had a story to tell. They just decided they were going to do this thing because they were special and talented, just like their parents told them. And they go straight from high school right into college, and then right out of college straight into a writer's room. And then we wonder why the shows they make are so narcissistic in character and unable to actually convey science fiction ideas in a science fiction show without just ripping off classic tropes from previous attempts at making these things. My wife had wanted to watch the cartoon crossover episode of Strange New Worlds, and after watching that, I decided to go ahead and just sit there and watch Star Trek Strange New Worlds with her. Since she's not a hardcore Trekkie, in some ways it's an interesting experience and makes it more enjoyable for me because she brings a grounded point of view that a long-term Trekkie can't view the show with. However, it's not that she doesn't recognize the very many flaws with it, or also thinks that the original stuff is higher quality despite being lower budget. But the very last episode of season 1, they basically, it's possibly the best episode of that season, just in terms of engagement with the story. In many of the episodes, I find there's this hump around the middle of the episode where I find it real just tooth grinding and just hard to get through. Once through it, like the final act of the show tends to be better, but like they have an issue with doing their middle act for some reason. But that episode, the season 1 season finale, that episode was, a lot easier to enjoy, in large part because so much of it was lifted from Balance of Terror from the original series, because it was an alternate take on that episode if Pike had remained captain of the ship and Kirk hadn't been captain of the Enterprise during that incident, leading to war and all that other kind of good Star Trek sci-fi goodness. And so go figure, this episode that okay, this actually feels like Star Trek. Well, of course it does, because so much of the dialogue and scenario and plot was lifted from an original series episode. But then that got me to thinking, in terms of how much the new Star Treks rely on referencing and recreating old tropes from older Star Treks. I mean, yes, it's cop-out storytelling, yada, yada, yada. But considering that these kids, and they're still kids, haven't been through any of the stuff that you would need to be able to organically be able to write good science fiction, because talent can't be taught. You either have it or not. You can be taught skills and you can be good at the craft of doing something, but it doesn't necessarily mean it's inspired in any way. But if they're ever going to learn how to write science fiction, they need practice writing science fiction, I guess is the point. So should we be more forgiving and more patient with some of these shows because the people making them don't really know what they're doing yet, but over time with practice and by, going through the motions of what has succeeded before, they will hopefully slowly learn to do better and come up with their own stuff and all the various things that we want from them so that the show actually finally really gels and feels like real Star Trek. Because for whatever reason, the veterans of the War on Terror have not been coming home and filling a bunch of jobs in Hollywood and coming up with a bunch of science fiction stories. I'm sure a few of them have, but it has not been nearly as endemic as it was in the post-World War II era where so many people had to serve. So without that, we're never going to get good science fiction unless the science fiction writers we have are able to learn to write good science fiction. But that also means, though, that if they're putting out crap when they're first starting, those shows might not last long enough for them to ever get their sea legs under them. If the shows get canceled, they might not be able to get another gig, and so they're not able to progress to a point where they're actually putting out good content. But if every time some new show is being put together, they don't hire people who were writers on previous successful shows of the genre, instead they just get a new crop of kids and they run it a couple years and then it flames out, and then they, like, we're never going to get any good science fiction writers if none of them are allowed to practice enough to become good science fiction writers, I guess is what I'm saying. It's sort of like the difference between Ghosts of the Shadow Zone and Girls Gone Vampire. Ghosts of the Shadow Zone is like the 4th book I put out. It's very much a proof of concept, largely just to kind of just work out whether or not spiritual entities as player characters can be done well with my rule system. The setting itself is, very sandboxy and possibly too open-ended. And in the end, I obviously don't put out a lot of source books for it because there's not really a whole lot to do with it. It's a proof of concept. Girls Gone Vampire, on the other hand, is taking many of the exact same elements, but restructuring them, repackaging them in a way that's much more interesting and engaging, obviously, because I've cranked out a bunch of material for it just to make sure that it's got plenty of, supplemental resources for people who are interested in playing Girls Gone Vampire, and also informed by having written 40-some-odd books in between those 2 points. I was able to practice and get better, and then when I went back to try to do the same concept again, get a better product out of it. If I had done Girls Gone Vampire originally instead of Ghosts of the Shadow Zone, Girls Gone Vampire would have been just as flawed as Ghosts of the Shadow Zone is. So having the ability to go through the process of having made Ghosts of the Shadow Zone helps inform the later attempt to do the same concept but better. And so that's why you should probably check out Girls Gone Vampire on DriveThruRPG and or Amazon.com. And I'm not saying to forgive any of these shows. The companies have not made friends with their fans very well. The actors have not made friends with their fans very well. There's been an awful lot of hostility and antagonism between franchise and consumer. There's a lot of bad blood right now. We're all supposed to be sympathetic to, the people in the strike, but they're just as much guilty of having created this atmosphere as the people at the top of the pyramid. I don't know if you ever watched that guy's Screen Rant videos, where the dude's, playing both the writer and the executive producer of pitch meetings and stuff. But that is kind of the general impression of what these people are like. So seeing the big name actors go up against the big name Hollywood execs, it's a little, Godzilla versus Mechagodzilla. Except maybe it's more like Rodan versus Mechagodzilla. We don't really have a dog in this fight. We kind of don't like either of them. And so I'm not telling you to overlook any of that. I'm just saying to keep in mind that if we do ever want to get to a point where we have any good science fiction on television ever again, unfortunately, we're going to need people who've had the time to go through a bunch of awkward, bad science fiction so that they can get good. Because environmentally, our society is not really set up to give people the sorts of experiences that can really have them come in with the sorts of profound moral questions and observations of humanity or speculations about our future that are really worthy of our time. With, of course, the obvious notable exceptions that I'm sure you'll tell me about in the comments below in your way of telling me that I'm completely wrong about all this. Star Trek's great. Michael Burnham. I love me some Michael Burnham. Well, anyway, until next time, stay waspinated.
Oh, and while I'm at it, if you happen to be one of those people that prefers having your rulebooks broken into 3 separate core rulebooks, might I suggest checking out Girls Gone Vampire?